Okay, hi. So this video is going to be going over the key points in B4, which is form and function of ecosystems in the new IB Bio course. And we're going to do essentially a full page. It'll take a couple erasings of my board so I can write big enough for you, but you can kind of plan to spend about 1 page on B4.1, which is the adaptations to environment, and then another one on ecological niches. So together that makes up B4, which is our form and function of ecosystems. So when we say form and function, remember we're kind of looking at by form, we're saying basically what defines an ecosystem, and function, we're basically looking at how do they work, like what makes them kind of work the way they do. So it's a really good place to start with ecology, because then we can go into kind of C4 and look at more of the interaction and interdependence of the organisms in it, but kind of first just looking at how do we define it. So the first little diagram we're going to do is making sure we're really good on essentially what is an ecosystem, what is a population, what is a community, what is a habitat, what is a biome. So some definitions, but that are pretty crucial as we start going through all of this, that we're really clear on those so that we can kind of build from there. So first definition, we're going to kind of go from big to small. So when we're talking ecosystems, we're really not usually talking a lot about individuals. We're going to be talking kind of at the smallest level about a population. So a group of the same species that are all found in that ecosystem. That's kind of really our smallest level of that. So let's kind of start with that. So if we say one species living in one area at one given time. So we're talking all the deer that are in that forest at kind of this moment in time. That's going to be our population. So we're going to kind of build on that quite a bit through other units, but for today we just want to make sure we're kind of clear on the distinction between these. And then in that definition we have another important word that goes with this unit, and that is going to be the idea of that area. So the area that they are living in, we would say, is the habitat. So the habitat is the kind of location where they would be found. Okay, so then if we say, yep, that's great, understand that that is one population, but a given environment is much more than just the deer. So the next level would be to look at all of the living organisms. So this is going to be, we're going to say interacting populations. So we are kind of using the definition for populations in our definition. So we're using that word because we just defined it. So the interacting populations, and then the rest of the definition is going to be the same. So it's going to be in one habitat. So I'm going to change it to habitat now that we define that at any given time. So a couple of key things that we're going to pull out there is just making note of this word interacting. So when we talk about a community, they are having some interaction with each other. And when we say populations, populations are all defined as species. So the other thing I'm going to put in parentheses is that when we talk about this, they are all biotic factors. So biotic means living. So we are only talking about the living components of an area. And that is going to be our definition of community. Okay, and we're going to add 2 more. So then we're like, okay, that's great. Now I'm looking at all the living organisms. And this is going to be a real focus in this B4 area. But I'm going to say all living organisms are also impacted by other things in that habitat. So they're going to be impacted by amount of sunlight, the amount of rain, the amount of wind, the pH of the soil, things like that. So when we add that aspect in, we no longer say we're just talking about the community of living things. We're trying to account for the environmental factors as well. And so now we're going to call it an ecosystem. So we're going to define our ecosystem as being all living, which is going to be biotic, and abiotic, because that's our kind of vocab word, factors. So we're looking at both the living and the non-living factors kind of in one area, again, at one time. So our key kind of vocab that we picked up here was that we picked up this idea of abiotic. And so an abiotic factor is a non-living, And we mean by that like never living, so not dead dead matter, things like that. And so that's going to be things like pH, temperature, sunlight, carbon dioxide levels. Depending on what kind of environment, any of those kinds of things we're going to pick up as our abiotic factors. So then that is our definition of an ecosystem. And I'm going to draw one more, and when I drew this on my own page, I kind of ran out of space across, so if so, just put it below. Because the other thing that we talked about in this unit is when we talk about an ecosystem, I'm still talking about one forest or one sand dune area or one desert area. So I'm still really emphasizing that one area. So if we wanted to talk more generally, not just in one area, but in any area like that. So we're not just saying this forest, but what are we looking at in forests? So if we want to look at that, we're now looking at biome instead. So we'll kind of look at that. So any ecosystem, we'll say a group of ecosystems. I'm just going to check and make sure my writing's still there, but I'm going to go down here. A group of ecosystems with similar biotic and abiotic, and I'm going to put abiotic first because the abiotic drives the biotic. So essentially, because of the fact that they have similar precipitation, rainfall, sunlight, all of that, they attract similar biotic life. So we're going to say a group of ecosystems with similar abiotic conditions and biotic communities. But the key is they don't have to be in one area. So we're talking any desert across various areas. Okay, so that's a definition. The key thing that we're picking up on is the shared abiotic and biotic factors, and that's going to be our definition of biome. So if you look at the course syllabus, it does say there's a dot point that they could ask you for any of the kind of broad characteristics of the 6 biomes, but then the only 2 that they ask you in terms of kind of adaptations for are the desert and the rainforest. So I'm not going to go into the 6 biomes. I think hopefully most of you just have a general idea that you should be able to recognize that tundra is like the Arctic one, whereas you should recognize that a taiga is like a winter forest area, but not Antarctica. So if you can just revisit and make sure you have a broad sense in that they may actually kind of describe like a grassland or something, an organism living in it, and assume you have some idea of what the climate conditions are of that. But I think most likely the questions you'd be asked about would relate to the desert or the rainforest, because then they itemize those 2. So worth a quick review of it, but we're going to focus on those 2 for our summarizing purposes. So kind of on that note, what I want to do is I want to kind of elaborate here at the level of essentially ecosystem or biome. And I want to identify kind of the 4 different biome or ecosystems that they address specifically in the syllabus. And I want to kind of talk about in that environment, what is the threat to survival? So there's a lot about adaptations. It does not tell you which adaptations you need to memorize. It says you need to know adaptations to sand dunes. So the most important thing is, do you understand what the threat to survival is in that area? Because if you understand what the threat to survival is, you should be able to work out, okay, well, what adaptations would address that threat? So rather than redoing a whole bunch of charts with lots and lots of adaptations, I thought we would do this in a slightly different way for revision and just kind of go through and make sure we understand kind of what are the concerns and then how can organisms kind of get around those. Okay, so example, so we're going to talk about basically 4 ecosystems or biomes worth knowing. So again, these are the ones that were named as the ones you would have to be able to identify adaptations from. So not the only ones, but the kind of main ones. So we want to say this is the actual environment, and then say what is the actual threats that are, do organisms have to overcome. Again, I use the word interchangeably, ecosystems and biomes. The question could be localized and like in this desert area, or it could be like in any desert. So there's again kind of overview on this. So the first one would probably be more specifically looking at an actual local ecosystem, but it can be part of the general issues found in grasslands and things like that. But the first thing that you could have to know is what are some challenges in sand dunes? And I'm going to list sand dunes a little bit separately to desert, just because they do have it at separate places in your course. There is some overlap in that there are many deserts that are sand-based. There are also deserts that are more hard rock-based, so they're not a perfect correlation. So we will list them separately, even though a lot of the problems are the same. So when we're talking sand dunes, generally speaking, they are dry. And then the other thing that they have a unique problem with is wind. So sand dunes tend to be a bit windier. And so kind of what are the concerns in that kind of environment? So one is if you have a really windy environment, one issue is need for kind of secure anchoring. So if you're a plant, if you're in a windy environment, you run more threat of kind of not being able to stay remaining in the soil. And then the other thing that is a part of both wind and dry is the risk of transpiration or water loss. So, high risk, I'll phrase it as, of transpiration. And transpiration, we are going to talk more about at different times. But for right now, you don't need to know kind of the details of transpiration, but you do need to know that transpiration is basically water loss, and specifically out of the stomata. So adaptations are going to be helpful if they can limit this. So if we can limit transpiration, which is that water loss through the stomata, then that's going to increase an organism's ability to survive in that environment. If we can create root systems that really are effective at anchoring, that's going to help them and so forth. So if you're talking about adaptations, those would probably, most of the adaptations would be beneficial to one of those two things. Very similar, but just going to pick up on a couple other things, would be the desert. The desert has less threats specifically. We don't normally talk as much about the winds. So they are still going to be very dry. The other thing that we're going to pick up with the desert is specifically the high temperatures. So dealing with the extremes in terms of the heat. So what kind of things are we going to look at? We are going to look again at kind of reducing the risk of transpiration, but also water storage. So we need water storage solutions. Again, we need to limit transpiration. And then the other thing that you'll see things of in terms of, sorry, I lost my line a bit there, is related to the heat. So we need kind of mechanisms for heat loss. So those can be things like giant elephant ears. Elephant's not necessarily desert, but similar idea. So some of the fox that we looked at had the really large ears. So any organism that's in a quite hot environment, they need ways to lose body heat. And then also because of the high amounts of sun, they need mechanisms for shading. So that could be creating burrows and things like that. Okay, next one is another biome that came up, which is the rainforest. So if we say, okay, what are the issues in a rainforest? So this time it's going to be two main issues that you're often going to try to relate it to, and that is going to be essentially like strong rains. So then needing kind of security, and then the other thing is kind of a dark understory. So those are kind of the concerns. So when we talk about adaptations, what do we need? Again, we need kind of strong protection against kind of rains. And then they need access to light. So one of the big problems for plants is trying to figure out how to access light when that top canopy can often remove kind of the light from getting to the lower levels. And then the other one that comes up for animals is that we talked about the monkey and the swinging. So I'm just going to make a note of that we need things to use trees for shelter. And then I'm just going to put swinging. Not really sure exactly how to connect that one, but that's another thing in the rainforest is because of the extreme amount of plant life. Animals are successful if they can figure out how to access food that's trapped in the trees because it doesn't fall to the ground as much as you would find in other ecosystems. So accessing food can be a little bit difficult. So if they have mechanisms like a sloth who uses the trees for shelter or a monkey who uses trees in order to access food, those are helpful adaptations. Okay, and then the last one that came up was swamps. So if we're talking about a swamp, what are the kind of concerns or the threats there? So a couple things there is that they often have kind of lots of kind of salts and minerals. So they tend to be less pure water and have more kind of buildup of salt and also just depositions and pollutions and things like that. And then again, they're very wet. So lots and lots of water. So it's not aquatic organism like life, but a very, very wet environment. So it's kind of a land area that has to overcome a bit of that. So some things that you could look for here is ways to deal with the fact that they're high salt is to maintain water balance. And so that's going to relate to kind of osmosis mechanisms. So whether that's getting rid of the salt or bringing in enough other minerals to kind of create environments where pure water comes in. Once you're revising at the end of the year and you know more about osmosis, hopefully that will be a little bit easier to connect as well. But if you're in a high salt environment, that does pose some risks. So they need ways of managing that. And then just the high aquatic environment, some challenges there are kind of basically related to obtaining gas, so gas exchange challenges. And also challenges related to seed dispersal. So essentially what's going to happen for gas exchange is it's things like growing roots that go upwards so that they can still obtain carbon dioxide that way and release oxygen. So it can be things like that. It can be seed dispersal can be seeds that float because of the aqueous environment. If the seeds are supposed to be spreading by landing, then they get kind of stuck in the mud. And so floating is a way around that. Strong protection around the seeds and so forth. So again, you don't have to memorize set ones, but those are kind of the 4 named environments that you could have to discuss or look at an adaptation for. So I think the best way to prepare that, given you don't have to memorize set adaptations, is to know like what are the challenges. And then if you know kind of what are the challenges of that environment, hopefully that triggers your memory of some ideas of what some adaptations for that would be. Okay, so we're going to go from that to talking a little bit now about adaptations and what generally they are and remind us about the types of them and so forth. All right. Okay, so how do we manage extreme environments or manage the abiotic factors in an environment? Is due to having adaptations. So survival in any environment depends on the adaptations. And so that's a key word in this kind of topic, is that we're clear on that. So we did a little bit of a flow chart, so we're just gonna do a very brief version of that. So kind of the 3 things you need to know about adaptations are, where do they come from, what types are there, and what enables them to occur. So kind of going first to just where do they come from. One really important fact, and this will be very clear to you when we've done more on natural selection, but is that all adaptations are genetic in nature. So basically they came from some sort of change in the DNA. So from a mutation, from a new combination of DNA that came about through meiosis, but there's been some sort of genetic change. Then for that adaptation to stick around, that genetic change has to give a survival advantage. So the result of that genetic change is increased survival. And in particular, if we want to pass it on through the DNA, increased survival and reproduction. And the key thing is it has to be in that environment. So the same thing as an adaptation in one environment, but it's not an adaptation in another environment. So fur color is a good example. Having dark fur would be an advantageous thing in a forest environment. Having white fur would be an advantage if you were in an Arctic environment. So there's a natural genetic variation in color, but what determines which is an adaptation is the environment. So organisms that have the right adaptation for that environment will survive, and then they will pass it on, and it will become more common over time. And that whole process is survival of the fittest. And that's kind of a very casual term. What we're going to get much better at knowing is that that is part of the steps of natural selection. So we have not gone and done that properly at this point in the year. If you're watching this as revision, then I would, when you're leading up to exams, I would expect that you'd be very good on that and be able to do much more than that and really map out the steps. Along the way, I just want you for right now to be very aware that it has to be genetic in nature, and then the environment causes those that have the adaptation to out-survive and out-reproduce, leading to more and more of it. Okay, so then that is what they are. The next thing we need to be clear on is what are the types. And for each type, we're going to give just a couple of very general examples that hopefully can kind of use across different ones. So I'm not going to say this organism has that. We're going to look more at kind of general things that you might see that are helpful. Okay, so the three types are physical. And again, this is different terminology, but you'll see other places call it structural. That's kind of what the VCE term for it is. So if you're ever comparing it, and AP I think uses that as well. So if you're ever comparing it, that will be where that would come from. And so physical is going to be an actual body part. So you can also think of it as, if it's physical, it should be visible. So it should be something that you could see on the organism that would help you be able to actually identify that. So an example in plants might be something like stomata on the underside. And that's a way of reducing transpiration because they're away from the sunlight. But that is a physical thing. I could look at it and I could say, oh yeah, there's the stomata, they're under there. It could be something like spines that are used to protect against herbivores. If we're talking animals, it could be something like camouflage, or it could be something like large ears or long arms. So all physical things that you could see. If we were talking chemical, this is going to be a body functioning. So this is going to be some sort of internal process. So this is going to be like a function. And so you can think of it as the way an organ works. So internal process. These are often not visible, so a lot of times you would have to be told this. So this would be something that you wouldn't just be able to look and detect. You would have to be given information on that. So some examples of that we talked about include things like toxins and venoms. So those are things that are going on inside. It can include things like increased or decreased metabolic rate. And it can include things like in animals, like changing, if we go back to water, it could be like increased water reabsorption. I'm going to actually hopefully you write erasable pens. Decreased urine output, that's just easier for a summary. So ways of kind of working the kidney differently to decrease the amount of urine. Okay, and then the last category you need to know is behavioral. And a behavioral we are generally only going to see in animals. Most kind of plant responses are actually going to be categorized as chemical, just because they're believed to be the direct result of single kind of chemical movement of auxin and things like that. So when we get to tropisms, you'll kind of make that connection, but we generally consider those to be a chemical adaptation. And so if we're talking an animal, it should be like an action. So it's not a single internal body thing, it's an external action. And examples of that are going to include things like burrowing, any sort of hunting behaviors. I think we'll talk about that in the next one. So some of this we're going to repeat when we get to the next part as well. So those are all things that are going to be important for that. But burrowing is another example of one that is like related to heat. So that would be to reduce heat. Increased metabolism would be to deal with the cold. Decreased urine would be to deal with things that are dry. This would be things that are hot. This is things that are dry. So you should be able to kind of know based on the environment. I'd like you to be able to connect what are some common adaptations for that environment. Okay, so then now we're going to continue on with this kind of first point here. So I'm going to actually leave this up for a bit and just erase the bottom too, because we're saying survival depends on adaptations. So based on the adaptations that an organism has, that's going to determine where it can survive. So we're going to use that to link now into looking at zone of tolerance. And zone of tolerance, which we're going to talk about in our 4.2 section in a minute, we're all one video, but I have it on different sheets, is also what determines the fundamental niche. So they're all kind of interrelated, but we'll kind of build on that. So essentially, based on an organism's interactions, they will have a range of where they could survive. So essentially, your adaptations determine the distribution, because the adaptations suggest what abiotic range they can survive in. So adaptations determine what abiotic environments they can tolerate. I'm going to use the word tolerable because we're going to use that in a minute. So what adaptations determines if you have adaptations that can manage high salt levels, then you could live in a higher salinity environment. If you do not have the adaptations for that, that's going to limit that. So your adaptations determines which environment, and then which environments are tolerable determines where the species will live. So adaptations determine which are tolerable, which then causes the species distribution. So remember, species distribution is just where are the species found. So essentially where they can survive is where they're going to be found. Okay, so you need to be able to look at the little map of this and kind of piece this together. So here's my little axis here. Okay, and so here is going to be my abiotic factor. So it could be temperature, it could be pH, something like that. And then up here is going to be the kind of amount, I'm going to call it species distribution. But it could also, another way of saying that is just the population size or density. So some indication of where the population is big. And so what you're going to find is this is really the key. So there are going to be abiotic conditions that are intolerable. So it might be at this low range, there's literally none at the higher low. Then there's going to be some where you see a small amount of the organisms, so they can survive there. And then you're going to see a range where they're most successful. So then you're going to usually see kind of a boost, which is going to be the area that they're found, like there's a high distribution in this range, there is some present in that. So we've done a few examples of this, so hopefully you're used to this. This is definitely something that comes up quite a bit in database questions. So being able to make the connection between areas with dense kind of distribution being favorable and areas where there's less distribution being areas that are less favorable. So anywhere that they can be found, this whole range, so as long as there's some organisms, we call that the zone or range of tolerance. So those are the areas where abiotically they can survive. But there's still going to be areas where we see high distributions. And so there's not like a steadfast one of where, like I'm just picking arbitrarily where it looks highest. So wherever there's a large distribution, that would be the optimum. And the optimum, we're looking for an area with a large or high distribution. So if the distribution is higher, we would assume that those abiotic conditions are in fact optimum for growth. Okay, last little bit that we're gonna do, and I'm trying to use about an hour, so we're at 30 on this one, so that's a good sign. Last little thing is to talk about coral reefs. So some organisms have adaptations to survive in a really wide range. Coral reefs are the opposite, so coral reefs have a very small range of tolerance. So they're a good example for this area. So they're really important because they provide a home for a lot of aquatic organisms. So they're crucial, but they're not the most resilient. So that's something to know. So the reason why we're looking at them as an example is that they have a narrow range of tolerance. So they're not necessarily adapted for really wide swings in their abiotic factors. In order to understand kind of the factors, one thing you need to know is when we say coral reefs, we're actually talking about a mutualistic relationship between two organisms. So a coral reef is defined as a coral polyp, which is actually an animal, plus zooanthid algae. So it's the two things living together. B and C4 will pick up more mutualism, but hopefully you have just like a general understanding that when we say a relationship is mutualistic, we just mean that it is beneficial to both. So this is kind of my coral polyp. And then inside is all of the zooanthid algae. And the reason why it's mutualistic is because the algae are actually photosynthesizing. So they actually create the food for the polyp, for the animal. And then the polyp creates a nice home for them, partly because the polyp forms a hard exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is made of calcium carbonate. So they are creating this kind of hard exterior, which creates a really good home environment. And then they don't have to worry about hunting or doing anything to get food. So they're basically a stationary animal because their way of consuming food is essentially to have the algae living inside of them and immediately providing them with nutrients that way. Okay, so because of this, the environment has to be such that these guys are able to photosynthesize and these guys are able to form calcium carbonate cells. So we need an environment that is supportive for both of those goals. So what you would need to require then, and I'm gonna put the specific values on here. I have seen an IB test question that did actually want the specific values. Like you had to know it was 7.8, not 7.2. So it is something I would say leading up to your exams, probably worth a quick memorizing of. At least to know a few of them would be really helpful. So first of all, in order for this to happen, if they're gonna be photosynthetic, they need access to light. So there's going to be two requirements that I'm going to put as kind of related to that. So it needs to be shallow enough. And the specific requirement is it has to be less than 50 meters deep. So that's kind of where is considered shallow enough. And clear water. And the reason for that is for the sunlight to get through. And the reason why we want sunlight is for this point down here. We need them to be able to photosynthesize. So for them to successfully photosynthesize, that has to be the case. The other thing that's interesting is that it gets too warm, essentially the polyps, who are animals again, they undergo like a physiological stress if the temperature rises. And one of the things they do when they get stressed is they push out their actual algae. So it'd be like if you're getting really stressed and then you're kind of like mean to your friends and are like, leave me alone, I'm too stressed, I can't hang out with you tonight. And then that's a really bad idea because then you're gonna be lonely and more stressed. So same idea with the coral, it's not a good move. But when they get stressed, they push out and eject the algae, kind of like I can't manage you and all my stress. And then they lose their photosynthetic helpers. So we don't want that to happen. So we need to maintain a good temperature. So their range is between 23 degrees Celsius and 29 degrees Celsius. And then if stressed by heat, they will actually expel their algae. And I would know this term, zooanthalae, please. I just want to write it over and over. So we wrote it once. So make sure you could say that in a response would help. If you draw a blank, use the word algae. A lot of times with IB, there's a lot of ways you can get marks. So it might be that by being able to call them their proper name, you get more marks, but you can still get some marks without it. Okay, so 23 to 29 degrees Celsius. If they are overheated, they will expel the algae. And again, the algae are their key. That is how they photosynthesize. So it's really important that they don't do that or they lose their food source. If they expel their algae, the algae is what actually gives them their color. The calcium carbonate in the polyp itself tends to be just a white color, but the presence of different kind of microbiomes, different types of algae living in there is what gives them dramatic colors. So if that happens, they basically go pale. They become essentially an empty exoskeleton without having the algae inside of them, and that gives them a pale color. So we call that, I'm just making sure you can read that, I wrote a bit too far. We call that coral bleaching. So coral bleaching, the term bleach comes from the fact that they go kind of white, but the actual biological explanation is that they go white because they expelled their algae, and the reason why that's problematic is because they need their algae, because the algae are actually the ones making food for them, and then the organism will die from a lack of food. So it's a problem on many levels. There's another one that is going to be a little bit tricky to remember the exact numbers for, but we're going to write it down anyway. In fact, I have to look them up. It's between 32 and 42, and it's a weird range, 32 to 42 parts per 1,000 salt, essentially. I'm just going to say parts per 1,000 salinity, which is essentially, if you don't know that, you may want to write in parentheses that that's how salty it is. And the reason for that is related to water balance. So in too salty of environments, they'll start to lose water and dry out. If they were in too fresh water of environments, they would actually absorb water. So that's all related to kind of osmosis, water balance. When you're studying for your final exam, and we've done everything on hypertonic and hypotonic and all of that, I would expect that that would make more sense to you, and you could be like, oh, yep, good, I understand why that's really important. For where you're at, if you're doing just in terms of just understanding before, you don't need to know the details of that. I'm fine with you just knowing important for water balance. And then the last one, which is going to relate to this, so my arrows are probably a little bit chaotic, but I'm trying to make sure that for each of the requirement you could explain why. So this one's a little bit standalone. The other two are related to photosynthesis. And the last one is related to that exoskeleton. So they have to have a pH of 7.8 or higher. And the reason for that is because calcium carbonate only forms at high pHs. So you need to have basically a neutral or an alkaline environment for calcium carbonate to form. So that's needed for the calcium carbonate to form. And if you need that calcium carbonate to form. That's what you need for their exoskeletons. So if your pH is wrong, they won't be able to form those exoskeletons, and then they don't have the kind of external protector that they need, and then they can be damaged by other animals or other just things going on. So they need that kind of for protection. One little thing we'll do on this page, because it does come up probably more than anything else in kind of data stuff. So if you have room up here, we're going to make a note. And that is that if you increase pH, or increase CO2, that is going to cause a decrease in pH. And so as a result, one consequence of the carbon dioxide emissions is that it's actually resulting in a lower pH in oceans. So one consequence of that is, there's many consequences, but that specific thing there, we call it ocean acidification. And that comes down to this point here, that if that happens and our oceans become more acidic, then the coral reef who are found there are going to have a much harder time surviving. And so that's where that becomes problematic for that. So little point, we did a couple of different things on that. I don't think it's necessarily direct content to know, but it's more using it in database, is that anytime you're looking at pH, just remember that relationship with carbon dioxide, so you're kind of aware of that. Okay, so the second half of B4, so form and function of ecosystems, the first is being really clear on what do we mean by ecosystem, so really understanding those abiotic determinants and the fact that the abiotic determinants, abiotic factors are what determines what organisms can survive there based on their adaptations. So the relationship essentially between adaptation, abiotic, and the organism itself and their distribution is really what we just covered. So now we need to pick up the second half of, if we're talking about an ecosystem, we're also talking a lot about the living interactions, so the community level essentially. So looking at kind of how all of that plays in as well. So that's kind of a bit of trying to piece it together. This section feels a little bit all over the place in parts, but we'll try to kind of pull it all together. So first of all, it's called ecological niches. So let's take a minute and quickly define what we mean by niche. So if we're going to have a whole section on this, we want to define it and look at how all the parts we're about to talk about come back to relating to that. So the general definition, which they have in your syllabus, so it's always good to check what the IB is using because you'll find lots of different things. So their kind of general definition is it's the role of an ecosystem, the role of an individual or a species, but we're going to say a species, which is made up of individuals, and it's their role within their ecosystem. Okay, so that was kind of their overarching one, but now let's talk about that term role is a little bit broad for my liking. So let's say, okay, well, what do we mean by its role? So when we say its role, we're going to further break that down into two things. So when we say what is your role in your ecosystem, we're going to say kind of what biotic interactions do they have? So in other ways, in what way do they interact with other living things? And then, which was kind of what we already just talked about, but also what are the abiotic requirements that they have? So part of an organism's niche is related to what can they tolerate. So that is actually kind of, we already talked about that, so we're just going to put here, link zone of tolerance. So an organism's niche is going to be somewhat defined by what are its ability, where can it live, and what does it need its environment to be for it to be able to survive from an abiotic standpoint. What we're we're going to pick up now is a little bit more on the biotic side. And this is going to show up quite a bit again in C4. So we're really just kind of starting it now. So just a heads up on that. Like this is a big area, this community interactions of where we're heading. But when we say it's biotic interactions, one of the most important things is that when we talk about its role in an ecosystem, it needs to be in an ecosystem where it effectively has a food source. So the most important kind of biotic factor that we're going to look at is its kind of predator and prey relationships. Or kind of its feeding needs. So when we say, okay, what is the niche of an organism? We're saying, okay, what are its abiotic requirements? And then the next question is like, what's its food source? Does it have a food source? Because that's going to determine its role in that ecosystem. And who is it food for? So who's eating it? Who needs to be eaten by it? Who's it in competition with? And then what is it kind of bound by? So again, we're going to continue a lot more community interactions in C4. This one seems to be pretty linked to feeding related. So we're going to kind of essentially zoom in for this section on kind of looking at an organism and kind of how does it get nutrition, and what adaptations does it need to be able to get nutrition in its environment. So that's kind of the special focus, I would say. Sometimes it's a bit tricky trying to figure out where they put things the way they are, so we're trying. Okay, so because we're talking about this being all about feeding, the next thing that goes into is then we need to look at kind of types of nutrition. So if we say how they get food is part of an organism's niche, then let's kind of look at what are the different options. So main division, which you have hopefully been learning since, middle school, since 7th and 8th grade kind of level, is just to divide it into autotrophs and heterotrophs. So our first kind of big distinction is, are they an autotroph or are they a heterotroph? So we have autotroph versus heterotroph. And then we're going to kind of break it down a little bit. I don't know why I capitalized heterotroph. Anyway, they are not one more important than the other. That was just purely arbitrary. Okay, so when we say autotroph, it is a self-feeder. So what that means is they are able to make their own carbon compounds. And we're using this term carbon compounds. I'm trying to avoid using the word energy because we are going to kind of talk about there is a distinction between making the glucose versus the ATP. So we're trying to kind of clarify that, but we can basically say in parentheses, making our own glucose. We'll talk when we get to photosynthesis about how, sometimes that carbon compounds don't even become glucose. They go directly into other carbon compounds. So that's why we're saying that, but general idea is make your own glucose. Okay, within that we have two categories. So we have photoautotrophs and photoautotrophs, like it sounds like, are going to use photosynthesis. So they are going to use energy from the sun to actually form the glucose. Chemoautotrophs, instead, they actually don't use sunlight. They actually are able to use chemicals, and they oxidize chemicals, and the oxidation of chemicals is what gives them the energy to then reform the compounds into glucose. So they do it without sunlight. You don't need to know any details at this point anyway about how that happens, but just the idea that instead of using the energy from the sunlight, they get energy from oxidizing chemicals. And if you're like, oh no, what on earth is that word oxidizing? I can promise you before you finish this course, you will be well aware of it. And if you do chemistry, you'll be well aware of it then. Right now, you don't need to worry about it yet. Just know that they can use certain chemicals, for example, things like iron or sulfur, to actually get their energy. So they're able to do it a different way. Okay, so that is our autotrophs. Then we have our heterotrophs. So by definition, a heterotroph is going to rely on other organisms to get their organic compounds. So rely on other organisms to obtain their carbon compounds. And again, we can use that somewhat interchangeably with like their glucose that they're going to use for cellular respiration. Okay, and then within that though, we're going to then divide it. And so you notice that I did not say they eat. So by definition, we're going to be careful because where we're going with this is that we're introducing that what makes it a heterotroph is it relies on others for nutrition, not eats, because that actually is what a distinction between the next one. So now we're going to further divide this category up and we're going to say, okay, within heterotrophs, we actually have two types, which is we have holozoic nutrition and we have saprotrophic nutrition. And this is a new word to the new IB course, this word holozoic. So I don't know why they got excited about that word, but they have decided they would like you to know that term. So it's essentially internal versus external digestion, which would be an easier way of referring to it. So I need you to know that's the distinction, but then you have to learn the weird words for it. So holozoic nutrition is just internal digestion, and particularly that it involves ingestion. So in this case, they do actually ingest an organism, and then inside the organism is when, so they ingest them and then internally break it down into compounds, they then get absorbed. With saprotrophic nutrition, it is external digestion, and in particular, it's generally done with the release of enzymes. And then they're just absorbed. So they actually can usually just absorb the broken down nutrients straight in. And so that's why we want to avoid defining a heterotroph as one that eats organisms, because saprotrophs don't eat. They release acids and then they're able to absorb straight into their body. So that's why we're going to be careful about that. And then there's one final distinction to make within our holozoic nutrition is that generally speaking, we are talking about consumers. And the key distinction there is that they are eat living organisms or fresh organisms. And then there are also detritivores. And they are actually still ingesting, but they're just able to feed off of kind of decaying matter. So earthworms are kind of an example of that. So generally speaking, a detritivore, or like a vulture who comes and eats like a gross rotting thing, kind of a subset, but essentially they still ingest the organism and they still actually break it down inside. They just have a tolerance for more different types of organisms. They can be really helpful because they can help get rid of rotting things. They're not as helpful as saprotrophic because these ones, by actually breaking down the matter, they actually a lot of times return things to the soil. Just be aware that the term that you also might think of for this one that you've probably learned before is decomposers. So we're talking fungi, mushrooms, things like that, and also bacteria. A lot of bacteria fit into that category, whereas generally speaking, these are all going to be related to animals. These are just animals that eat more variety of sources, which just gives them an advantage because they can use maybe a food source that others cannot. But most animals are consumers, so that's a fairly small subset, but we do want to be clear that detritivores and decomposers are not the same thing, so we know that distinction. Okay, so that's essentially our types of nutrition. And like I said, I think those are probably the only terms that were brand new because you should have already known the others. But we are going to add one more thing to this. So we've kind of said all throughout this, I've made the point that we're talking about how do they get their glucose. So they can make their glucose. Here they can use other organisms to either absorb glucose after breaking it down externally or internally, but all organisms have another step then. So all organisms still have to convert their glucose into ATP. So all living organisms then convert their glucose, carbon compounds, whatever we want to say. So we'll say carbon compounds to again clarify that we can actually use fats to do this. It doesn't have to be glucose. And so we need to do that into ATP by cellular respiration. And we're going to do the lot more on cellular respiration. By the time you finish your course, you will be so tired of hearing about cellular respiration. So ATP and cellular respiration are like major themes. So this is a little like tiny preview of the fact that we need to talk about ATP all the time. So it's going to come up in like every unit. So this is just a little note that even plants or bacteria that can make their own food still have to undergo this process to actually generate ATP. And that is done usually in the presence of oxygen. So it is usually an aerobic process. So certainly in plants and animals, almost all of our respiration is done aerobically. If we want to, we have some anaerobic process called glycolysis that does provide some energy, but it would be insufficient to meet our needs. So for us to thrive, we need to be in oxygen-rich environments so that we can do enough cellular respiration to have enough ATP to function. However, not all organisms have to have oxygen for it. Most do, but there are kind of examples. So specifically with bacteria and archaea, so a subset of bacteria and archaea so generally it's either bacteria or archaea, which remember are essentially a different domain, but one cell, unicellular prokaryotes are very similar. And so within those microorganisms, some can actually do it without, do not do aerobic respiration. And so again, I'm not entirely sure where this fit into the course, why this is here, but it is. So we will just quickly include those weird 3 definitions as part of kind of nutrition because it relates that way. So of our subset, we can define them as either being obligate aerobes, which is what we are, which means they require oxygen to meet all their needs. So it doesn't necessarily mean every second, but if they're going to essentially have enough oxygen, enough ATP, they're going to have to use aerobic respiration, and therefore they must have oxygen most of the time. So that is us. We are, this is where most organisms fall, is that we are obligate aerobes. There's another group of bacteria, but also yeast fall into this category, that are what are called facultative aerobes, which means they can use oxygen, but their ability of doing respiration without oxygen is also quite good. So they can also survive without oxygen. So they are basically, they like oxygen, so they can successfully survive without oxygen as well. And we write in parentheses, but like it. So if it's present, a lot of times they will use it. Some yeast won't use it even when it's present. They just default to doing anaerobic processes, but they're not hurt by it. So it just basically means they're a bit more neutral on oxygen. We generally only see this with microorganisms. Large organisms just cannot meet their energy demands without aerobic respiration. But some bacteria can do this. And also, like I said, yeast is a small unicellular prokaryote that is fairly successful at respiring without oxygen. And then the weirdest group is there is a small group of organisms that actually cannot tolerate oxygen, and so they are called obligate anaerobes. So an is a prefix, like a scientific prefix that means not, so not oxygen. So these ones are actually killed by oxygen. So they have a really weird kind of trait where not only do they not need it, but they are actually killed in the presence of oxygen. So they cannot be found where oxygen is. But again, that's not a bad thing, because what that ends up doing is it means they create a unique niche where they're in an environment that has no oxygen. Almost nothing else can live there, but that is actually the ideal environment for them. So it creates kind of a unique niche for them. So it kind of relates to nutrition, kind of relates back to niche, because when we say what are its abiotic requirements, one example of an abiotic requirement is something like oxygen. And for almost all organisms, oxygen is a very important abiotic requirement, but there is a subgroup of organisms that is not something they require from their environment, and that gives them kind of a unique advantage. All right, so just to give you a check-in, I was about a little over halfway on my page. So just hopefully your spacing is similar, but you are welcome to write giant and take up 7 pages if you want. I'm always giving you an update on where my pages are at. Okay, so we are going to continue. I'm going to leave that definition for right now. So we are going to talk a little bit more about, now we know the types of nutrition. We're going to say, okay, so whether you're an autotroph or a heterotroph, you have some needs that actually help you to meet that. So you need to have some adaptations that support your method of nutrition. So that's going to be our next thing, is specifically, and this is not too dissimilar to what I did on the last one. I just want to be more specific to nutrition. So we gave some examples when I said for ecosystems, but in 4.1, really those adaptations would be asking about ways of overcoming the abiotic factors. And here we're looking at adaptations that help with them meeting their food source needs. Okay, so I'm just gonna again give a few examples of some categories to bear in mind. You do not have to memorize set ones, so as long as you understand the concept of what is an adaptation and the concept of kind of how these relate to dietary demands, you should be pretty good. So the main one that we talked about with physical that they did specifically mention is dentition, which is a funny word, but just think going to the dentist. So teeth in particular. So that's probably the most likely physical one you could be asked about, because there was a whole thing on that. And remember, the main thing I want you to remember overall, we went through all the different types of teeth. Feel free to revise that. I'm just trying to do a summary. Is essentially that flatter teeth are more associated with digesting plant material. So I'm just going to make a note that we're going to remember that flatter teeth are generally found in herbivores. So we have teeth that are adapted for our diet. So whether it's a grinding teeth for a herbivore or more sharp teeth for tearing into meat for carnivores. So that is a physical adaptation that we kind of covered quite a bit and talked a little bit about. The other thing that we talked a bit about is chemical. And I mentioned these on the other one, even though I probably should have mentioned them here. So this in particular, because venom and toxins and things like that aren't really about abiotic factors. They're always about either obtaining prey or protecting from predators. So that's going to be things like poisons and venoms. And remember, they can be used both ways. So they can actually be used both to obtain prey. So I'm going to make a note of this. They can be used for obtaining prey. So that's what neurotoxins are, or neurovenoms. So a neurotoxic venom is a venom that is basically causes the prey to go still and then allows them to actually access them. And then of course, a lot of poisons are actually deterrents. So it can be used for obtaining prey or avoiding predators. And so the book here kind of course wanted you to be able to say what are some adaptations for getting food and what are some adaptations for avoiding other people eating you. So those you can kind of put those either way and work that out kind of from there. And then lastly, we're going to have behavioral, of course. And most of the time, if we're talking like for an animal, behavioral is going to be things like hunting patterns. So like hunting and gathering behaviors. So that's where it can be things like we talked a bit about the monkey swinging between the trees. And so that's a way of it actually accessing more food sources. It can be pack hunting, so hunting together. It can be the bear who waited at the top of the stream for the salmon. So some sort of kind of meeting or ritual regarding, the hunting or gathering of food. And then along that lines, we also had the other one is that this is related to nutrition. And when we talk nutrition, we don't want to totally leave plants out. So we're just going to make a note that plants also need adaptations. So just because they photosynthesize doesn't mean they don't need adaptation. So plants also have adaptations that are specifically related to nutrition. And then, of course, because they photosynthesize, the adaptations they have are going to be related to photosynthesis. There's examples related to like gas exchange and stomata, but at this point, the most important one is to make the link to light. So basically access to light. And this links back to our first topic, related to biomes of rainforest. So looking at what are some adaptations of plants in rainforest where light access is a problem. And then there's the two, in case you don't remember these terms, just so you know, they are the lianas and the epiphytes. And those are both examples that have to essentially use other trees to kind of grow upwards to get better access to sunlight so they can photosynthesize. So that also came under that same category. And again, I'm not going to go through every one because there are not named examples. You would just need to be able to either identify or give an example of one. So if you're like, from reading this, you're like, oh, yep, I'm good. I could clearly, you know, make up something related to one of those categories. If you're like, that's stressful, then go back to your notes and memorize specific ones. Up to you, but for the sake of keeping this brief and a consolidation, I'm just going general categories. Okay, I'm gonna erase just so I have enough space, but we are on to our last point now. So that's kind of everything nutrition related. We are gonna come back, like I said, and talk a lot more about community interactions in terms of competition. Well, now it relates to what we're about to talk about, but also a lot in C4. So the main one here is just that recognizing that predator-prey relationships involve adaptations and determine kind of your environment and your place in the environment. Okay, so let's go back to niche. So we talked a bit about that's the general definition. So I wrote there that that is definition. And I might just clarify that that is the general definition. So I always thought when I add stuff, sorry, you don't have to add that. In other words, that is just the general definition for an ecological niche. We are going to narrow that down a little bit now and kind of define it in two different ways. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, okay, from there we can say there's two different types. One is the fundamental niche. And this is where kind of the two parts come together. So the fundamental niche of an organism is basically the same thing as their zone or range of tolerance. So it's basically saying, essentially, where could it survive? So in what abiotic conditions could the organism survive? So that's going to be, okay, and based on their ability to withstand temperatures, based on their pH needs, based on their need for all of these things, this is the area of a habitat that would be appropriate for them, and this is where they could be successful in that ecosystem. However, we say here, when we talk about the role, it doesn't just mean that. So fundamental niche is kind of a non-reality. So this is like a theoretical concept. So it's basically in theory where they could survive, and it's rarely reality. So rarely do we see organisms really occupying their fundamental niche because it doesn't take into account what's going on with other organisms. So fundamental niche is a little bit hypothetical. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the fundamental niche and then we're going to add the biotic factors. So this is, yep, abiotically, this is where it could be. And so we're going to add some biotic considerations. So the first kind of abiotic consideration is there available prey? So it needs to be somewhere where there is an opportunity for them to be able to access food that they need. There needs to be looking at things like where might there be predators and parasites. So if there's a high level of kind of parasites in one area, even though they could survive there, they're going to end up avoiding that area because of them. And then the big one that we're going to mainly focus on is competitors. Some people would consider this to somewhat be a part of this. So you could say that the fundamental niche is including that you can survive in the abiotic environments and have enough food. So where you put that kind of can vary, but the key thing that makes the distinction between the fundamental niche and the realized niche is looking at this concept of competition. So we need to know a principle that relates to this. So the reason why this is so important is because of the competitive exclusion principle. So the competitive exclusion principle, which you do need to be able to name and explain, basically states that two species cannot occupy the exact same niche. So two species cannot be trying to use the same space and the same food source, because if that happens, they will compete so harshly that it will end up being to the detriment of both of them, or at least to one. So they're not both going to be able to be successful occupying the exact same area. So two species, and you would be able to explain this, cannot occupy the exact same niche. And when we say niche, we're going back to this. So it doesn't just mean the same space, it means space and food source. So essentially we just want to clarify that. So i.e. that includes the physical space, but also their food source. So technically two things could actually occupy the same space potentially if they weren't also trying to use the same food source. So if they're found in the same food source, but one hunts in the day and one hunts at the night, that can work as long as there's enough space. That can be successful, but particularly if they're trying to live in the same area and eat the same thing, it's not going to be successful for them. And what is going to end up happening is one of two things. One is it will just eliminate one species altogether. So if they try to do that, whatever the more successful species is basically just going to outcompete and destroy the other one. Or they kind of end up settling into a situation where they're not in competition anymore. So like the example I just gave, they might come up with different hunting times. They might end up eating slightly different food sources. They might divide a space where one lives kind of higher up and one lives lower down. And so when that happens and they kind of take what was one niche and separate it, that's called niche partitioning. So again, I gave the example in class, and that's basically like two siblings are trying to live in the same bedroom. They're constantly irritated with each other. So their solution is to basically put up a partition or to put up a curtain and be like, this is your side, this is my side. So they're in the same space still, but instead of both being in each other's space constantly and causing conflict that's not good for either, they divide the space, and that creates that. It doesn't always have to be even, so the older sibling might say, this is my space, you get this little space, and all of this is mine. So it's not always fair and even, or it could be that they just eliminate the younger one, and they have to go live in a different room, and they win. So it can happen, either of those things can happen, but something has to occur whereby they can both survive happily, or one of them is going to get eliminated. We're going to look at the happier alternative right now, which is that they do somehow manage to find a way in which they can both exist in a similar habitat, but within their own niche. And so that causes what we call the realized niche. So the realized niche is basically every organism making that compromise that says, I could, in theory, live there, but if I do, it's not going to create a balanced, stable ecosystem, so over time, I end up residing only there. And that realized niche is unique to every species. So every species has its own unique realized niche, which is its own unique role in their ecosystem. So they have their own unique abiotic environment they're successful in. They have their own unique kind of food source and feeding relationship, that they are working for them. They have a food source, they have predators that are keeping them kind of in a correct population size, and the environment is one that they can tolerate. And that organism, that's all the factors that are unique to them, and that's their kind of role, their home, and demands of their ecosystem that they fulfill. Okay, so that is B4, and more ecology to come and other subtopics, which will be covered in later videos. All right, bye.